Christmas Eve. My son smiled when he slid the papers between the pierogi and the cold kielbasa. "Sign it, Dad." "Just estate planning." But page 6 said otherwise. 60 days and everything I owned with these hands, the house, the warehouse, 40 years of steel and fire, would belong to someone I had never met. I looked up. Let my fingers shake, just enough. "Maybe tomorrow," I said. They relaxed. Fatal mistake. Because I had read every word 3 weeks ago, they thought I was slipping. What they did not know was that I was counting every move, every lie, and building something that would break them first. One small thing before we start. If you have a second, drop a comment and tell me. Have you ever trusted someone with everything, only to find out they had a plan of their own? Yes or no? I read every one. I am glad you are here with me for this one. A few details in this story have been shaped for storytelling purposes. The lesson at its core is what truly matters. The envelope landed on the table between the gingerbread cookies and the cold coffee. And my son told me the house was not mine anymore. I am Walter Kovacs. People call me Walt. 72 years old. Retired steel mill foreman, with 38 years of furnace heat permanently baked into the skin of my hands. My right hand carries something else, too. A scar that runs from the base of my thumb to the inside of my wrist. Raised, rough, the color of old copper. I got it in the mill explosion of 1996. Or at least that is what I have told everyone for 26 years. The truth about that scar is something I will get to later. And when I do, it will change everything you think you know about this story. I sat at the head of my own dinner table on Christmas Eve in the house I paid off in 2001 with overtime checks and a second mortgage that nearly ended my marriage. 4 generations of Kovacs men have lived under this roof. The brick is original. The porch sags on the left side where my father hung a swing in 1963. The radiators clang at 4 in the morning, like they are trying to tell you something, and I know exactly what they are saying. Because I have been listening to this house longer than I have been listening to anyone alive. And I watched my eldest son slide a thick manila envelope across the tablecloth like it was a holiday card. Danny Kovacs. 43 years old. My son, though the word felt heavier that night than it ever had. He had been a construction project manager once, before the contracts dried up and the bids stopped coming, and the clients who used to return his calls quietly removed his number. He showed up 16 months ago with his wife and a rented truck and a story about temporary setbacks. The setbacks never ended. But apparently the paperwork had. "Dad, this is just formalizing what we already talked about." Danny said it with his mother's eyes and his mother's gift for making dangerous things sound reasonable. "It is better for everyone." Skylar sat beside him. Skylar Kovacs, 39. Danny's wife. A woman I had met exactly twice before she moved into my guest room. She dressed too sharply for a family Christmas in a working-class Pittsburgh kitchen. Back straight, phone face down on the table. The posture of someone who had rehearsed this moment. "We looked into it with our financial advisor," Skylar added. "It protects you too, in case of liability." I opened the envelope. The Christmas lights above the sink reflected off the stapled pages, red and green sliding across words like irrevocable and transfer of deed. I turned to page 6. My scarred fingers traced the clause I already knew was there. "Let me tell you something about foreman. We do not sign off on anything until we have inspected every weld, every joint, every beam." And what was broken here was spelled out in 8-point font on page 6, paragraph 3, subsection B. Automatic transfer of full ownership. After 60 consecutive days of non-payment on a collateralized loan. The loan Danny had called temporary. The collateral Danny had called just a formality. I counted backward from December 24th. 57 days remained. I looked up from the page. Danny was watching me the way people watch old men, scanning for confusion, for hesitation, for the slow blink. That means the words are not landing. I gave him exactly what he expected. "Let me read it again in the morning," I said. My eyes are not what they used to be. Skylar's shoulders dropped a quarter inch. Relief. Danny nodded and reached for the gingerbread. They thought I had not understood. I understood everything. I had understood it 3 weeks ago, when I pulled the photocopy from my filing cabinet in the basement workshop. Every document I have ever signed in my life has a copy in that cabinet. A foreman's habit. When you inspect a weld, you keep the test results until you are sure the structure holds. I had read the clause under a 40-watt bulb at 4 in the morning, and I had done the math. And I had said nothing, because silence is a tool. Same as a welding torch. You use it when the joint needs to be opened, not sealed. They cleared the table around 10. Danny washed the dishes. He always did when he wanted something, the same way he mowed the lawn the week before, asking to borrow my truck in high school. Skylar dried. I said goodnight and walked down the hallway to my bedroom. The one at the back of the house where the floorboards creak in 3 specific places that I know by heart, and they do not. I sat in the chair where Irina used to read. 38 years I worked in that mill. My hands held steel beams that weighed more than my son. Those same hands held a pen 16 months ago and signed away the house those hands paid for. Not because I was foolish, because my son asked me to help him. And I believed that is what it was. The tin box sat on the shelf where it had been since October of the year Irina passed. Small, dull metal. The kind of box that once held pipe tobacco. Back when men smoked things, they rolled with their own fingers. Irina gave it to me on my birthday, 3 weeks before the cancer won. She said, "Open it. When you need to remember who you are." I had not opened it. Not at her funeral. Not during the months of silence that followed. Not when Danny arrived with his truck and his story. I picked it up. Something shifted inside. Light. Papery. Sliding from one end to the other. I held it in both hands and felt the grain of old metal under my thumbs. Irina's hands had held this box. She had sealed it in the garage, probably while I was at the mill, probably while she was already sick and had not told me yet. I put it back. Not yet. Whatever was inside would wait. I had 57 days, and I needed to think like what I was, a foreman. Inspect first. Disassemble. Second. Fix what is broken third. But only after you understand every load-bearing wall. I turned off the lamp and sat in the dark. Through the wall, I could hear Danny and Skylar whispering. Their voices rose and fell in patterns I could not quite decode, except for 2 things that came through the plaster clearly enough to make me sit very still. A name I had never heard before. And a dollar amount that had 6 figures. This was not about my house. This was about something much bigger. Something that started long before Danny pulled into my driveway with a rented truck and a rehearsed smile. I sat in the dark and I listened. And I began to plan. But that night did not start on Christmas Eve. It started 16 months earlier on a September afternoon when my son pulled into the driveway with a rented moving truck and a wife I had met exactly twice. And if I am being honest, it started long before that. It started on a night in 1996 when the sky above the east side turned orange and my boy ran 6 blocks in his pajamas to find me. Let me tell you about the explosion first. Because if you do not understand that night, you will not understand anything that comes after. November 14th, 1996. I was working second shift at the Resnick Steel Partners Mill on the east bank of the Monongahela. Furnace number 4. We had been running a pour that was already behind schedule when the thermocouple failed. The reading said 1400 degrees. The actual temperature was closer to 1800. By the time I saw the color of the slag change, it was already too late. The blast blew the inspection hatch off Furnace 4 and sent a wall of molten steel across the casting floor. 2 men died. 6 were burned. I was the 6th. I was pulling a man out from behind the slag pit when the secondary rupture hit. Liquid metal sprayed across my right hand and wrist. I did not feel pain at first. What I felt was heat so absolute that my brain simply refused to process it. Like staring at the sun, your eyes shut down before the damage registers. They carried me out on a stretcher through the main gate. The ambulances were already lined up on the access road, lights spinning red against the smoke. The fire crews were hosing down the exterior walls, and the water hit the hot brick and turned to steam that rose like ghosts into the November sky. Danny was standing at the chain-link gate, 8 years old. Blue pajamas with a hole in the left knee. No coat. No shoes. Holding a flashlight that was not turned on because the mill fire lit up half the block, and he did not need it. He had seen the news break on television. Mill explosion, East Side. 2 confirmed dead, 6 injured. And before Irina could stop him, he was out the door and running. 6 blocks downhill through streets he had never walked alone at night. Past the corner store and the laundromat and the vacant lot where the older kids played basketball in summer. He ran until he reached the gate. And then he stopped. I do not know what he saw exactly. I was on the stretcher by then. My hand was wrapped in something wet that had already soaked through. My face was black, with soot. The paramedic was cutting my sleeve open with shears. Around me, the sounds of a disaster. Radios. Shouting. The deep groan of cooling steel contracting in the wreckage. Danny did not cry. He did not call out. He just stood at the fence, with both hands wrapped around the chain link, and watched them load me into the ambulance. Irina told me later that he walked home by himself after the ambulance pulled away, walked into the house, past the dinner she had left on the counter, past the television still showing the breaking news footage, and went to his room. He closed the door. A boy who cries you can hold. A boy who just stands there watching his father carried out on a stretcher, hands gripping a chain-link fence in blue pajamas, with no shoes on a November night in Pittsburgh. That is a wound that does not close. I spent 4 weeks in the burn unit at Mercy Hospital. Skin grafts on the hand and wrist. Physical therapy for 3 months after that. The scar healed the way scars heal on working men. Rough. Permanent. A topography of raised tissue that I learned to read like Braille with my other hand in the dark. Every ridge and valley a reminder of Furnace 4, and the man I tried to pull out and the boy at the gate. I have been paying for that night ever since. Every favor Danny asked me for after that had the ghost of that chain-link fence behind it. The truck in high school. The co-signed apartment lease. The startup money that vanished. The second round of startup money. And finally, 16 months ago, the house itself. Just sign it, Dad. It is a formality. I heard the gate clang shut every time. So when Danny pulled into my driveway on that September afternoon with a rented moving truck and backed it over the curb onto the grass I had reseeded in August, I said nothing. Skylar stepped out of the passenger side in heels that had no business on a cracked Pittsburgh sidewalk. They started unloading before I finished my coffee. Just a couple months, Dad. Danny said it while carrying a box-marked office past me on the porch. Until we are back on our feet. I watched them unload for 2 hours. 16 boxes marked kitchen, a filing cabinet, a standing mirror taller than me, winter coats, 3 of them, heavy wool, still in dry cleaning plastic. You do not bring winter coats for a couple of months. I said nothing. I helped carry the filing cabinet up the stairs. That first afternoon, while Skylar arranged the guest bathroom like a woman setting up permanent residence, I walked past the back bedroom and saw Danny inside. He had a tape measure stretched across the far wall. He was writing the dimensions on his phone. He did not see me. A tape measure on day 1. That is not a man settling in. That is a man taking inventory of what he plans to own. There is a memory I carry, like a slag burn in my chest. My boy, 8 years old, standing at the chain-link gate of the mill at 9 o'clock at night in his blue pajamas. No shoes, no coat, watching his father get loaded into an ambulance. He did not cry. He just turned around and walked home. I have been paying for that walk ever since. So when I saw the tape measure, I closed my mouth. When I noticed Skylar counting the kitchen cabinets the next morning, writing figures in a small notebook. I poured her coffee and said nothing. When Danny started parking in the center of the driveway instead of to the side, I moved my truck to the street, because that is what guilt does. It turns a 72-year-old man who forged steel for 3 decades into someone who gives up his own parking spot to a son he thinks he failed, who watches a stranger rearrange his dead wife's kitchen and says thank you, who signs a document he knows is wrong because the boy at the gate is still standing there. 26 years later, gripping the chain link in his blue pajamas with no shoes and no coat, and the ambulance lights are still spinning, and the father on the stretcher still has not said, "I am sorry." Guilt is the most reliable furnace I have ever known. It never cools. It never shuts down. And it runs on nothing but memory. I signed the contract on October the 14th. A Tuesday. The kind of Tuesday that doesn't announce itself, no wind, no rain. Just a flat gray sky pressing down on Birchfield Road like a steel plate waiting to be cut. Danny had left the envelope on the kitchen counter 3 days earlier, next to the coffee maker, as if proximity to caffeine would make me more agreeable. Estate planning, he said again at breakfast. Skylar nodded from behind her oatmeal, her spoon moving in small, precise circles. Just so everything's in order, Dad. You know. In case. In case. 2 words that carry more weight than a full ladle of molten slag. I picked up the envelope that Tuesday morning. 14 pages. Legal paper, not letter size, the kind that lawyers use when they want you to feel small. The font was tight, 11 point, maybe 10. My reading glasses sat on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, right where Irina used to keep her African violets. I put them on and I read. The first 5 pages were what Danny described. Beneficiary designations. A living will template. Contact information for a lawyer I had never met. Helen Zhao, Esquire, Liberty Avenue, Suite 401. Standard language, standard clauses. The kind of words that make death sound like an administrative inconvenience. Page 6 was different. It started with a paragraph about collateralized obligations. I know what collateral means. I spent 40 years in a mill where every shift was collateral against your body. But this paragraph used the word differently. It tied my house 4412 Birchfield Road, Allegheny County, Lot 7, Block 19, and the warehouse on Hayes Avenue to a loan agreement between Danny Kovacs and a company called Ridgeline Property Trust, LLC. If monthly payments on that loan were not received for 60 consecutive days, ownership of both properties would transfer automatically to the trust. No hearing, no appeal, no phone call, just a signature on page 14 and a notary stamp, and everything I had built with these hands would slide across a table like a Christmas envelope. I read the paragraph 3 times. Then I closed the document, put it back on the counter, and poured myself a second cup of coffee. I did not mention it to Danny. That evening, he came home from a job site in Cranberry Township with drywall dust on his collar and a smile that sat crooked on his face. He asked if I had looked at the papers. I told him I had skimmed them. He said the lawyer needed them by Thursday. I nodded. He went upstairs. Skylar stayed in the kitchen, loading the dishwasher, placing each plate into the rack with surgical precision, as though the porcelain might testify later about how carefully she handled things. On Thursday morning, I signed page 14. I want to explain why. Because anyone listening to this story will wonder. They will say, "Walt, you read the clause. You understood it. Why did you sign?" Here is the answer. Because of the boy at the gate. Because every time I looked at Danny, 43 years old, thinning hair, jawline going soft, bags under his eyes from projects that never paid on time, I still saw the 8-year-old in blue pajamas standing barefoot on asphalt, watching his father get loaded into an ambulance. I saw the silence, the absence of crying, the way his fingers wrapped around the chain link like he was holding the world together with his hands because no one else would. A father who survives a furnace explosion owes a debt. Not a financial debt. Something heavier. Something that accrues interest in the dark. In the hours between midnight and 4 a.m. When you lie awake and listen to your own breathing and wonder whether the scar tissue on your wrist is a reminder or a receipt. So I signed. I told myself, it's estate planning. Danny wouldn't. He's my son. The notary came to the house on Friday. A woman named Gail, late 50s, silver glasses on a beaded chain. She watched me sign, stamped the page, and left in a green Subaru. The whole thing took 11 minutes. 11 minutes to make 40 years of equity disappear into a sentence. I did not sleep that Friday night. On Saturday, I went to the basement. The basement of 4412 Birchfield Road is where I keep what matters. Not money. I keep that in a credit union on Carson Street. What I keep in the basement is knowledge. Irina's tin box sits on the second shelf of a metal storage rack, between a toolbox and a cigar box full of furnace inspection tags from 1987 to 2004. Below the rack is my workbench. A 6-foot slab of Douglas fir I salvaged from a demolition on the south side in 1991. On that bench is a magnifying lamp, a legal pad, and a photocopier I bought from a church rummage sale for $30. I photocopied every page of the contract. All 14. I stapled the copies and put them in a manila folder, labeled Furnace Maintenance 1998. Nobody in this house would ever open a folder with that name. Then I sat under the 40-watt bulb that hangs above the bench, and I read page 6 again. Ridgeline Property Trust, LLC. I wrote the name on my legal pad. Below it I wrote 60 days. Below that I wrote the date I had signed, October 14. I counted forward, December 13. That was the deadline. 60 days. If Danny missed 60 days of payments on whatever loan this was, my house and my warehouse would belong to a company I had never heard of. I pulled the string on the bulb. It clicked off. The basement went dark except for the thin line of light under the door at the top of the stairs. I sat there in the dark for a long time. A foreman doesn't panic when a gauge spikes red. A foreman checks the system, identifies the failure, isolates the line. Then he fixes it or he shuts the whole operation down before anyone else gets burned. I had 57 days. That was enough time to check every gauge in my son's life. I pulled the string again. The bulb flickered on. I picked up my pen. At the top of a fresh page I wrote, Day 1, and underneath, in block letters, the way I used to label inspection reports at the mill, who is Ridgeline Property Trust. The 40-watt bulb above my workbench became my office lamp. Every night after Danny and Skylar went upstairs, usually by 10, sometimes by 10:15, I would open the basement door, descend 14 steps, pull the string, and sit. I kept a legal pad on the bench. Yellow, wide-ruled, the kind they sell in 3 packs at the dollar store on East Carson. By day 3, I had filled 6 pages. By day 7, I had filled 19. And by day 12, I had something that looked less like notes and more like a weld inspection report on my own family. Here is what I found. Ridgeline Property Trust, LLC was registered in Delaware on March 9 of the previous year. Its registered agent was a company called Evergreen Corporate Services, a name so deliberately bland it could have been generated by a machine. The filing listed no individual officers, no board, no physical address beyond a P.O. box in Wilmington. I found this on the Delaware Division of Corporations website, using the old desktop computer Irina bought in 2011. The screen had a dead pixel in the upper left corner that blinked like a warning light I kept ignoring. I searched for Ridgeline in Allegheny County records. Nothing. No property transfers. No liens. No recorded documents. A company that existed only on paper in a state 7 hours east of here, connected to my house by a single clause on page 6 of a contract my son told me was estate planning. On day 5, I drove to the Allegheny County Recorder of Deeds office downtown. I told the clerk I was checking on my own property, 4412 Birchfield Road. She pulled it up on her screen and turned the monitor so I could read. The deed was still in my name. No transfer recorded. No pending filings. but she mentioned something that made the 40-watt bulb in my head flicker. There was a UCC financing statement filed against the warehouse on Hayes Avenue, dated September 22, 3 weeks before Danny gave me the contract. The secured party was Ridgeline Property Trust. I asked her what that meant. She said it meant someone had claimed a security interest in the property. Like a lien, but quieter. Like a hand resting on your shoulder that you don't feel until it squeezes. I drove home. I did not mention the trip to Danny. That was day 5. On day 8, the kitchen changed. It started with the spice rack. Irina's spice rack had hung on the wall beside the stove for 26 years. A pine shelf I built in 1997, sanded smooth. 3 rows of glass jars labeled in her handwriting. Skylar removed it on a Wednesday morning while I was in the basement. She replaced it with a magnetic strip that held sleek metal tins with printed labels. Organic turmeric. Himalayan pink salt. Smoked paprika from Spain. The glass jars went into a cardboard box in the garage. I found them that evening. I held one up to the garage light, Irina's handwriting in blue ballpoint. Mielona paprika. Ground paprika. The same paprika her mother used in Krakow before the family moved to Pittsburgh in 1963. I put the jar in my coat pocket and said nothing. On day 9, Skylar reorganized the refrigerator. On day 10, she replaced the dish towels. On day 11, she bought a new coffee maker, one of those pod machines that sounds like a steam valve when it brews. The old drip maker, the one Irina and I bought at Sears in 2003, went into the garage beside the spice jars. I understood what was happening. Not because I am clever, but because I spent 4 decades watching how steel plants change management. First, they replace the signs. Then, they replace the safety protocols. Then they replace the foreman. The equipment stays the same, it's just that nobody who remembers how to operate it is allowed in the building anymore. Skylar was replacing the signs. On day 14, Mateo drew a picture. Mateo is Danny and Skylar's son. 8 years old. Brown hair that falls into his eyes. Quiet in the way that certain children are quiet. Not shy. Just listening. He reminds me of Danny at that age, except Mateo watches with both eyes open. Danny used to watch with one eye closed, like he was always measuring distance. Mateo sat at the kitchen table after school with a box of crayons and a sheet of white paper. I was in the living room pretending to read the Posto-Gazette. He drew for 40 minutes. When he finished, he brought the picture to me and held it out without speaking. It was a house. Not our house. A long, flat building with many windows. Like a motel or a dormitory. In front of the building stood 2 stick figures. A tall one with gray hair and a small one with brown hair. The tall figure was inside a square, a room maybe, or a box. The small figure was outside, reaching toward the square. Above the building, in red crayon, Mateo had written a word. The letters were uneven, tilted, the way children write when they are copying something they have seen but do not fully understand. The word was maple. I looked at Mateo. He looked at me. His eyes were serious in the way that only a child's eyes can be serious. No performance, no agenda, just the raw transmission of something he had absorbed from the air around him. "Where did you see this word, buddy?" He shrugged. "Mom's phone." I folded the picture carefully and put it in my shirt pocket, next to Irina's paprika jar label I had peeled off and kept. 2 pieces of paper. 2 pieces of evidence. Neither one admissible in court, but both readable under a 40-watt bulb by a man who was learning to treat his own house like a crime scene. That night, day 14, I added 2 entries to my legal pad. The first. Skylar Kitchen. Takeover. Systematic. Not decorating. Establishing territory. The second. Maple. What is it? Facility? Code name? Mateo saw it on Skylar's phone. Find it. I pulled the string. The bulb went dark. 43 days remained. Somewhere above me, through the floorboards, I heard Danny laugh. A big laugh, easy and warm. The kind of laugh that makes you believe everything is fine. The kind of laugh a man uses when he wants the walls to think he is happy. But walls are like steel. They conduct sound. And if you press your ear to them long enough, you hear what travels through. I pressed my ear to the basement ceiling and listened. I heard 3 things through the basement ceiling that night. The first was Skylar's voice, low and controlled, the way a shift supervisor talks when the line is behind schedule. She said, "The timeline is tight. We need him cooperative through Thanksgiving. After that, it doesn't matter." The second was Danny's voice, softer, almost apologetic. He said, "He trusts me. He signed it. Just give him space." The third was a name. Skylar said it once, quickly, like she was reading it off a screen. Maple Ridge, residential. Then she said a number, $40,200 a month, and Danny whistled low, the way men whistle when they see a price tag they cannot believe someone else will pay. I stayed against the ceiling for another 20 minutes. The conversation moved to groceries, then to Mateo's school conference, then to silence. I heard footsteps climb the stairs to the second floor. A door closed. The house settled. I went back to the workbench. I did not turn on the bulb. I sat in the dark, and I wrote by the light of my phone screen, small letters, pressing hard into the yellow paper. Maple Ridge Residential, $4,200. Month. Timeline. Through Thanksgiving. After that, it doesn't matter. I underlined the last 4 words twice. A foreman learns early that there are 2 kinds of failure. The first is mechanical, a cracked valve, a blown gasket, a thermocouple that reads wrong. You can fix mechanical failure. You order the part, you pull the shift, you weld the seam. The second kind is human. Human failure is when someone in the control room sees the gauge spike and does nothing. Not because they can't, because they've decided the explosion is worth it. Danny had seen the gauge, and he had decided. 42 days. The next morning, day 15, I found a document on the printer. Danny and Skylar had bought a wireless printer, a white plastic box that sat on the hallway table outside the guest bedroom. I walked past it every morning on the way to the bathroom. Most days, the tray was empty, but that Thursday a single sheet lay facey down in the output tray. Still warm. I picked it up the way you pick up a piece of hot steel quickly, by the edge, expecting pain. It was an email printout. The sender was someone named Roman Petrick. romanpetrick.advisor@legalbridge.com. The recipient was Danny. The subject line read, Kovacs. Phase 2 timeline. The body was short. Danny confirmed that WK signed 10/14. Filing the UCC1 amendment this week. Once the 60-day window closes, Ridgeline executes the transfer. No need for additional signatures. H. Zhao will handle recording. Keep the old man comfortable and offline. RP. Keep the old man comfortable and offline. I read it 3 times. Then I folded the paper into quarters, put it in my work coat pocket next to Irena's paprika label and Mateo's crayon drawing, and went downstairs to make coffee with the old drip maker I had quietly retrieved from the garage and plugged in beside the basement utility sink. The pod machine upstairs could have the kitchen. The drip maker was mine. On day 16, Mateo came to the basement. He stood at the top of the stairs and called down, "Grandpa, can I draw here?" I said yes. He descended carefully, both hands on the railing, his backpack over one shoulder. He sat on the concrete floor next to my workbench, spread his papers out, and opened his crayon box. For an hour we existed in parallel silence, me reading county records on the old desktop, him drawing. When he finished, he showed me the picture. This time, it was our house, 4412 Birchfield Road. He had drawn it accurately. The front porch, the dormer window, the crooked mailbox I kept meaning to fix. In the driveway, he drew 2 cars. One was Danny's gray pickup. The other was a black sedan I had never seen. He drew the sedan larger than the pickup, as if it mattered more. "Who drives the black car, buddy?" Mateo shrugged. "The man who comes when you're sleeping." I kept my voice level. Steel doesn't vibrate unless the frequency hits exactly right. What man? He talks to Mom in the driveway. Late. Mateo selected a brown crayon and began shading the porch railing. He wears a long coat. Does Dad see him? Mateo shook his head. Dad's always upstairs. I looked at the drawing. The black sedan had no license plate, not because Mateo forgot, but because 8-year-olds draw what they see, and apparently this car had nothing to see. No plate, no distinguishing marks, just a black shape in my driveway in the hours when a 72-year man was supposed to be sleeping. I taped the drawing to the wall above my workbench, next to a faded photo of Irina at the 1989 Polish Hill block party and a safety poster from the mill that read, "If you see something wrong, report it. Your silence is not neutral." That afternoon I called Sophie. Sophie is my daughter. 36. Lives in Lawrenceville, 12 minutes away on a good traffic day. She teaches high school chemistry at Perry Traditional Academy, and she has a mouth on her that could cut rebar. When Irina died, Sophie handled the funeral arrangements, the insurance paperwork, the thank you cards, and the casserole logistics, all in 4 days, while Danny sat on the porch and stared at the street. I didn't tell Sophie everything. Not yet. I told her I needed her to look something up for me. A company called Ridgeline Property Trust, and a place called Maple Ridge Residential. I told her it was for a friend. Sophie said, "Dad, you don't have friends. You have grudges and a workbench." She wasn't wrong, she called back 2 hours later. Maple Ridge Residential is a senior memory care facility in Cranberry Township. Long-term placement. Locked wards. Average stay, 14 months. Average cost, $4,200 a month. And the parent company that manages admissions? I already knew. Ridgeline Property Trust, LLC. The line went quiet. Then Sophie said, in a voice I hadn't heard since the night her mother's ventilator was turned off, "Dad, what is happening in that house?" I told her, "Come for Sunday dinner. Bring your husband. Don't tell Danny." I hung up. I looked at Mateo's drawings taped to the wall. The motel-shaped building. The black sedan. The word, Maple, in red crayon. An 8-year-old had mapped the conspiracy before I could. Children are better sensors than any thermocouple ever built. They don't interpret. They just read the temperature and report it. 39 days. The bulb above me hummed. The filament was old, fragile, close to breaking. But it still made light. That was enough. Sophie arrived on Sunday with 2 things. Her husband Leo and a manila folder thick enough to stop a bullet. It was day 18. November the 1st. The maples on Birchfield Road had dropped most of their leaves, and the ones that remained hung like rusted washers on a bolt barely connected, waiting for one good wind. Danny and Skylar had driven to Cranberry Township for a birthday party. Mateo went with them. The house was empty for the first time in 6 weeks, and the silence felt like a mill after the last shift clocks out enormous, echoing, full of the memory of noise. Sophie came through the back door without knocking. She does that. Has done it since she was 14 and decided that knocking was a formality for people who don't share blood. Leo followed her, polite as always, wiping his shoes on the mat twice. He's 34. Lean. Half Filipino. With the careful posture of a man who grew up being watched and learned early to give no one a reason to complain. He was in his 2nd year at Duquesne Law, top 12% of his class, and he had the habit of reading every document twice. Once for content, once for what was missing. I needed someone who could read what was missing. We sat at the kitchen table. I made coffee on the drip maker I had carried up from the basement for the occasion. Sophie opened her folder and spread its contents across the table like a surgeon laying out instruments. "Dad," she said, "this is bad." She had spent 4 days researching. Ridgeline Property Trust was one of 11 LLCs registered under a shared umbrella entity called Resnick Capital Partners. I stopped her there. Resnick. She looked at me. I told her. Resnick Steel Partners was the company that owned the mill where I worked for 40 years. The company that owned Furnace 4 when it exploded in 1996. She went pale, but only for a moment. Then she continued. Resnick Capital Partners was registered in Delaware by a man named Victor Resnick. Sophie had found his name buried in a corporate filing from 2 years ago, a single mention, no title, just a signature on an amendment to the operating agreement. Victor Resnick was listed as the managing member. The same Victor Resnick who had owned Resnick Steel Partners until the mill closed in 2007. The same Victor Resnick whose signature was on the safety waivers I had signed every January for 23 years. The man who owned the furnace that burned me now owned the company that was trying to take my house. I asked Sophie for a glass of water. She brought it. I drank it slowly. The glass was from Irina's set pale blue, hand-blown, bought at a craft fair in Ligonier in 1994. I held it with my scarred hand, and I let the cold travel through the tissue. Then I said, "Keep going." Leo took over. He had read my photocopy of the contract. Sophie had brought it to him 3 days earlier, and he had gone through it with a yellow highlighter and a red pen. His analysis was methodical, precise, the kind of work a foreman respects. The contract, Leo said, was not standard estate planning. It was a collateralized guarantee, structured to look like estate planning. The language on pages 1 through 5 was decorative beneficiary designations that had no legal force because they referenced a trust that did not yet exist. The real contract began on page 6. The collateral clause tied Walt's properties to a loan between Danny Kovacs and Ridgeline Property Trust in the amount of $340,000. Danny had received the loan on September 15th, 1 month before he gave Walt the papers. The loan's repayment terms were designed to fail. Monthly payments of $8,700, which was more than double Danny's reported income. If payments were missed for 60 consecutive days, the automatic transfer executed. Leo put down his pen. He looked at me. "Mr. Kovacs, this contract is a trap. It's designed so Danny defaults. When he defaults, Ridgeline takes your house and your warehouse. Danny doesn't lose anything. He never had anything at risk. You do. I already knew this. But hearing it from a law student with a highlighter and a red pen made it real in a way that my own 40-watt analysis had not. Sophie asked the question I had been avoiding. Why? Why does Victor Resnick want your house and a warehouse? I told them about the warehouse on Hayes Avenue. 2,200 square feet. Block construction, reinforced concrete floor, roll-up door facing the river. I bought it in 1993 with a small business loan Irina co-signed. I used it for side work, repairing machinery, storing equipment for other tradespeople, occasionally renting space to a welder or a carpenter who needed a roof. After I retired, I stopped using it, but I kept paying the taxes because Irina had signed for it, and letting it go felt like letting go of her handwriting on the loan documents. But Leo had found something I hadn't. The Hayes Avenue corridor, a 6-block stretch along the Monongahela, had been quietly rezoned 18 months ago from industrial to mixed use. The city had approved a technology corridor development plan. 3 parcels had already been purchased by shell companies. My warehouse sat on the 4th parcel. Current estimated market value, $950,000. The kitchen went quiet. The drip maker gurgled. Outside, a leaf detached from the maple and spiraled past the window like a slow-motion rivet falling from a beam. Sophie said, "They're not trying to put you in a home, Dad. They're trying to get the warehouse. The home is just where they store you while they do it." I looked at my daughter. She has Irina's eyes, dark brown, steady, the kind of eyes that don't blink when the furnace door opens. I looked at Leo. He was already writing on his legal pad, building a timeline, cross-referencing dates. I said, "I need a lawyer. A real one. Someone who has fought the Resnicks before." Leo nodded. He said, "I know someone. My professor. His name is Marco De Luca. He practices downtown. He lost a case against Viktor Resnick 8 years ago, wrongfully death suit from the mill closure. He's been waiting for another shot. I said, call him tomorrow. Then I poured 3 fresh cups of coffee, and I told Sophie and Leo everything. The eavesdropped conversation, Roman Petric's email, Mateo's drawings, the black sedan, the kitchen takeover, the spice jars in the garage. All of it. Every note on every page of my legal pad, from day 1 to day 18. When I finished, Sophie reached across the table and put her hand on my scarred wrist. We're not going to let them take this house, Dad. I covered her hand with mine. Irina's blue glass sat between us, empty now, catching the late afternoon light. 37 days. Marco DeLuca's office smelled like old radiator heat and case law. It sat on the 3rd floor of a narrow brownstone on Liberty Avenue, between a Vietnamese sandwich shop and a store that sold nothing but vacuum cleaner parts. The elevator was broken. I climbed the stairs. Each step reminded my right knee that 72 is not a number, it is a negotiation between bone and gravity is winning. Leo had arranged the meeting. He was already inside when I arrived, sitting in a wooden chair against the wall. Legal pad open, pen ready. Sophie had wanted to come, but I told her to stay home. I didn't want Danny or Skylar noticing patterns. 2 family members disappearing on the same weekday morning is the kind of thing Skylar would catalog. Marco stood when I entered. He was 61, broad-shouldered, with a gray beard trimmed close, and reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead like a welder's visor. His handshake was firm. His desk was a disaster stacked files. Post-it notes in 4 colors. A coffee mug that read, World's Okayest Attorney, and a framed photograph of a young man in a hard hat standing in front of a blast furnace. His son. I didn't ask. I recognized the furnace. It was number 2 at Resnick Steel, the one that ran until 2006. The hard hat had a red tag on the brim, Structural Crew. I knew without being told that the boy in the photograph was connected to the wrongfully death suit Leo had mentioned. Marco saw me looking. He didn't explain. He just said, sit down, Mr. Kovacs. Leo tells me you've got a Resnick problem. I sat. I put my manila folder on his desk, the same folder I kept in the basement, now containing the contract photocopy, the Roman Petric email, Sophie's Ridgeline research, the UCC01, filing printout, and Mateo's 2 crayon drawings. Marco opened it and read for 14 minutes without speaking. I counted. A foreman counts everything. When he finished, he closed the folder and removed his glasses. He pressed his thumb and forefinger into his eyes, the way men do when they are trying to hold something back. Anger, grief, recognition. Then he looked at me. This is Victor's playbook, he said, page for page. He did the same thing to 3 families during the mill closure. Structured loans designed to default. Shell companies layered so deep, you'd need a backhoe to find the operator. And always a family member on the inside. Always someone who shares your last name and your dinner table. That's how he gets through the door. I asked, can we break the contract? Marco leaned back. He said, the contract itself is technically valid. You signed it. You were competent. There's no duress on the record. But, and this is a big but, Mr. Kovacs, the contract is part of a scheme. If we can prove the scheme, the predatory loan, the UCC one filed before you even saw the papers, the connection between Ridgeline and Resnick Capital, the intent to transfer your properties to facilitate a real estate acquisition, then we don't just void the contract, we open a fraud investigation. And fraud makes the contract voidable from the moment of signing. He paused. But we need more evidence. What you have is good. It's not enough. I asked what he needed. He needed proof that Danny knew the loan was designed to fail. He needed communication between Danny and Resnick, or between Danny and Roman Petric that showed intent. He needed documentation of the Hayes Avenue rezoning connection. And he needed time. Time, I said. I have 35 days. Marco shook his head. You have more than that. They think you don't know. That's your advantage. Use it. Then he said something I did not expect. Mr. Kovacs, I need you to become a worse version of yourself. I stared at him. He explained. Right now, Danny and Skylar believed I was a cooperative, slightly confused old man who had signed a contract without reading the fine print. That belief was my greatest asset. If I reinforced it, if I appeared more forgetful, more passive, more dependent, they would stop being careful. They would talk in front of me. They would leave documents on printers. They would assume the old man was fading, and fading men don't fight. Marco called it controlled decompensation. I called it something simpler. The Foreman's Act. Every foreman knows the trick. When the plant manager comes down from the office for an inspection, you don't show him your best crew running at peak efficiency. You show him the struggling furnace, the patched-over valve, the line that's barely holding. You make the operation look fragile. And while he's busy feeling superior, writing notes on his clipboard about all the things he thinks you can't handle, you're behind him, running the real operation on the lines he's not watching. You let them see weakness. You hide the strength. I started that afternoon. When I got home, Danny was in the kitchen eating a sandwich. I stood in the doorway and asked him what day it was. He said Tuesday. I nodded slowly, then asked again. But what month? His eyes shifted. A micron expression. Not concern, but satisfaction. The kind of look a man gets when a plan is proceeding ahead of schedule. November, Dad. It's November. I nodded again. Slower this time. Right. November. I walked to the living room, sat in my recliner, and turned on the television to a channel I never watch, a home shopping network selling porcelain figurines. I let my jaw go slack. I let my eyes lose focus. I held the remote loosely, the way a man holds something when his grip is no longer reliable. Danny watched me from the kitchen doorway. I could feel his gaze on the back of my neck, like heat from an open furnace door. He watched for a long time. Then he took out his phone and stepped into the hallway. I heard him dial. I heard him say, quietly, "It's accelerating. Might not need the full 60. I stared at the porcelain figurines on the screen. A woman in a red blazer was explaining that each piece was hand-painted and came with a certificate of authenticity. I let a thin line of drool form at the corner of my mouth. The Foreman's Act had begun. 34 days. A man with one phone is making calls. A man with two phones is keeping secrets. I found Danny's second phone on day 24. A Thursday. He had left it on the bathroom counter beside the sink, a cheap prepaid device, black plastic, no case. The kind you buy at a gas station when you don't want your real number on the record. He must have forgotten it during his shower. The bathroom mirror was still fogged. His footsteps were already on the stairs, heading down. I had 40 seconds, maybe less. I picked it up. The screen had no passcode, arrogance, or laziness. I wasn't sure which. Both are fatal in a steel mill. The message app showed one contact, RP. I scrolled. The most recent message from RP, sent at 11:47 the previous night. Phase 2 confirmation needed by Deck 1. V. R wants to close before holidays. Zhao filing POA paperwork this week. Make sure he doesn't see a doctor before then. Danny's reply sent at 11:50. 2. He's slipping. Forgot the month twice this week. Won't be an issue. I memorized both messages. I did not photograph them. I couldn't risk the camera sound. And my own phone was in the basement. I put the prepaid device back on the counter in the exact position I found it, angled slightly toward the faucet, and I walked downstairs with the casual shuffle I had been perfecting for 3 days. In the basement, I wrote the messages verbatim on my legal pad. Then I added notes. POA equals power of attorney. They're filing for power of attorney. Make sure he doesn't see a doctor before then equals they need my decline to be undocumented. No medical record that contradicts the incompetency claim. VR equals Victor Resnick. Wants to close before holidays equals before Christmas. I sat under the 40-watt bulb, and I let the math settle like slag cooling in a mold. The contract's 60-day window would close on December 13. The power of attorney filing would come before that, probably early December. If they could establish that I was mentally incompetent, they wouldn't even need the contract to default. They could take control of my finances, my medical decisions, my properties, through a court order. The contract was the primary plan. The POA was the backup. 2 paths to the same furnace. 31 days. On day 26, I saw the black sedan. I had started sitting on the porch after dinner, part of the act. I wore my old mill jacket, let my chin drop to my chest, and pretended to doze. Danny and Skylar had stopped noticing me there. To them, I was furniture. A recliner with a pulse, but furniture sees everything. At 9:47 p.m., a black Lincoln Town car pulled to the curb 3 houses down. Engine running, headlights off. It sat there for 6 minutes. Then a man stepped out of the driver's side. Tall, dark overcoat, just as Mateo had described. He walked to the end of our driveway and stood under the dead streetlight, the one the city hadn't fixed since August. Skylar came out the front door. She didn't see me. The porch light was off, and my jacket blended with the brown siding. She walked to the end of the driveway and spoke with the man for 3 minutes. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw her hand him a small envelope, letter size, white, thin, and he handed her something back. A business card, maybe. Or a key. Then he returned to the Lincoln and drove north on Birchfield, toward the Route 28 on-ramp. I stayed on the porch for another 20 minutes, breathing slow. When I went inside, I wrote down the time, the car model, and every detail I could hold. Tall, 6'1" or 6'2", dark hair, overcoat past the knees. Left-handed, he had taken the envelope with his left hand. No visible plates on the Lincoln, just like Mateo's drawing. The boy had been accurate down to the absence. On day 28, Frank Petroselli rang the doorbell. Frank lives 4 houses east on Birchfield. 67, retired pipette fitter, built like a furnace, casing wide, thick, hard to move. We'd been neighbors for 31 years. He attended Irina's funeral. He brought stuffed cabbage and a bottle of Zubrovka and sat in my kitchen for 2 hours, saying nothing useful, which is exactly what a good neighbor does. But today Frank was nervous. He stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets, rocking on his heels, not meeting my eyes. He asked how I was doing. He asked about the house. He asked whether Danny was treating me well. Then he asked a question that had no business coming from a pipe fitter's mouth. Have you thought about your long-term care plans, Walt? I let the Foreman's Act run. I blinked slowly. I said, "What do you mean, Frank?" He stumbled. "Just, getting older. Whether you've considered places, facilities." He said the word like it tasted wrong. I scratched my chin. I said, "Irina always said she'd haunt me if I went to a home." Frank laughed. But the laugh was hollow, like a pipe with nothing running through it. He patted my shoulder, said he was just checking in, and left. I watched him walk back to his house. Halfway there, he stopped, pulled out his phone, and made a call. He stood on the sidewalk with his back to me, one hand on his hip. The call lasted 90 seconds. When he hung up, he glanced back at my porch. I had already closed my eyes. Furniture. That night I added Frank's name to my legal pad. I drew a line from his name to the word Ceden, then a dotted line to Danny, then a question mark to Resnick. The network was wider than I thought. The furnace had more vents than I could see, but every vent leads back to the fire, and every fire has a source. I needed to find the source. And I was running out of yellow pages. 27 days. On day 30, the house gave me a gift. It was a Wednesday evening, November the 13th. Danny had come home late, smelling like joint compound and cold air. Skylar was already in the kitchen, reheating borscht she had made from a recipe she found online, not Irina's recipe, which called for bone broth and fresh dill, but a shortcut version, with canned beets and dried herbs. She served it in new bowls. White. Geometric. No chips, no memory. I ate in the living room. The foreman's act was in full operation. I sat in the recliner with a TV tray and a spoon. And I ate slowly, pausing between bites to stare at the wall, as though I had forgotten what came next. Danny glanced at me from the hallway. Skylar did not glance at all. I had become ambient. A sound they no longer registered, like the refrigerator hum or the ticking of the hallway clock. At 8:15, Danny and Skylar went upstairs. At 8:22, Mateo was put to bed. I heard his small voice say goodnight, and the creak of his mattress springs. At 8:31, the guest bedroom door closed. At 8:34, I heard Danny's voice through the floor, muffled but present. I went to the basement. Not for the workbench this time, but for the heating vent. The house on Birchfield Road was built in 1947. Post-war construction, balloon framing, cast-iron radiators, later supplemented with forced air ductwork in 1978. The ductwork runs through the walls and floors like veins through muscle. And sound travels through ductwork the way heat travels through steel, fast, faithful, losing almost nothing. The vent in the basement ceiling sits directly below the guest bedroom's floor register. I had discovered this acoustic shortcut on day 19, when I heard Skylar humming a song I didn't recognize while folding laundry. Tonight I positioned myself below it, ear tilted upward, breathing through my mouth to stay silent. Danny had the call on speaker. His voice was clear. Skylar's voice was clear. And the third voice, female, older, precise, with the faint trace of an accent I couldn't place, was clear enough to transcribe. Danny spoke first. He said, "We're on schedule." He signed October 14. 60 days puts us at December 13. I've been skipping payments since day 1. Ridgeline hasn't received anything. The third voice said, "Good. Victor wants the transfer recorded before December 20. Helen will file the deed transfer on the 14th, the day after the window closes. We need one clean business day." Skylar said, "And the power of attorney?" The third voice said, "Backup only. If the old man makes noise, we file for emergency guardianship. Roman has a physician lined up, Dr. Aldis at Greenfield Behavioral, who will sign a cognitive decline evaluation without an in-person exam. But that's the messier route. The clean route is the contract default." Danny said. The third voice laughed. Quiet, controlled, the kind of laugh that comes from a woman who has done this before. Then she said, "The warehouse alone is worth $950. The development group is offering $1.2 for the full parcel house, warehouse, and air rights. Once we consolidate the 4 lots on Hayes, Resnick Capital sells to Vantage Corridor Development for the full package. Danny, your share is 12%. That's $144,000. That was the price of my son's loyalty. I did the math in my head the way I used to calculate tensile loads quickly, without emotion, because emotion makes the numbers lie." Skylar said. "And Maple Ridge?" The third voice said, "Placement is confirmed. Room 14, B, 2nd floor, memory care wing. Admission date is January 5th. We tell the court he wandered, or we tell the court he left the stove on. Either way. Once he's admitted and the guardianship is filed, he doesn't come back. He doesn't come back." 4 words. Spoken the way you speak. About a piece of equipment that's been decommissioned. Tag it. Store it. Forget it. I stayed under the vent for another 11 minutes. The conversation turned to logistics, notary schedules, filing deadlines, a meeting with Helen Zhao on November 22nd. Then the call ended. I heard Danny say, almost to himself, "I don't love this part." And Skylar's reply, quick and flat, as a blade on a table saw, "You don't have to love it. You just have to finish it." I descended to the workbench. I pulled the string. The 40-watt bulb came on. My hands were steady. A foreman's hands don't shake during a crisis. They shake after, when the shift is over. when the crew is safe, when you're sitting alone in the locker room and the adrenaline has nowhere left to go. I wrote everything. Every word I could remember. Names, numbers, dates. Dr. Aldous, Greenfield Behavioral, Room 14, B, January 5th, Vantage Corridor Development, 1.2 million, 12%, 144. Then I called Marco from the basement phone, a landline extension I had reconnected 2 weeks earlier, running through the old jack behind the water heater. No one in the house knew it worked. Marco answered on the second ring. I told him what I heard. When I finished, the line was silent for 5 seconds. Then Marco said, "Walt, this isn't just a contract scheme. This is organized property fraud with a guardianship trap. They've done this before. Victor and Nadia both." "Nadia," I said. Marco said, "The woman on the phone. That's Nadia Resnick, Victor's wife. She runs the operations side. Victor builds the structures. Nadia moves the people. She's the one who picks the family member. She's the one who picked Danny." I looked at the legal pad. 26 pages of notes. A pad that had started as a question, "Who is Ridgeline Property Trust?" and was now a map of a machine built to process an old man into a room number. Room 14B. I tore the page off the pad and taped it to the wall beside Mateo's drawings and the mill safety poster. Then I wrote on a fresh page, in block letters, "They have a physician. They have a room. They have a date. I have 25 days. The bulb hummed above me. Somewhere in the ducts, warm air moved through the house like a whisper looking for an ear. It had found one. Marco called it a Russian nesting doll. "Every time you open one company," he said, "there is a smaller company inside." It was day 32, November the 15th. Sophie, Leo, and I sat in Marco's office on Liberty Avenue, while rain streaked the windows and the radiator clanked like a hammer mill running off a beat. Marco had spent 72 hours pulling corporate filings, property records, and UCC statements from 3 states. The results were spread across his desk in a pattern that looked like a wiring diagram for a machine designed to do one thing. "Here is the structure," Marco said. He pointed with a pencil, not a pen, a pencil. Because Marco DeLuca does not write in ink until he is certain. At the top, Veiling and Nadia Resnick, individually. Below them, Resnick Capital Partners, LLC, Delaware. Below that, 11 subsidiary LLCs, all registered in Delaware, all using Evergreen Corporate Services as registered agent. Ridgeline Property Trust was number 7. Number 4 was called Vantage Corridor Development, the company that would buy the consolidated Hayes Avenue parcels for $1.2 million. Victor Resnick was selling to himself through a chain of paper walls. But there was a 12th company. Sophie found it. She had been searching Allegheny County business filings for any entity connected to Danny Kovacs. On day 31, she found it. Kovacs Development Group, LLC, registered on August 2nd, 6 weeks before Danny moved into my house. The registered agent was not Evergreen. It was Helen Zhao. And the filing listed Danny Kovacs as sole member. Sophie slid the printout across the desk. Leo picked it up and read the articles of organization twice. Then he said, quietly, "Danny didn't just sign up for the scheme. He built his own vehicle." Marco nodded. Kovacs Development Group had filed a letter of intent with the Pittsburgh Urban Redevelopment Authority to bid on a mixed-use development contract for the Hayes Avenue Technology Corridor. The bid required proof of site control, meaning Danny needed to demonstrate that he either owned or had contractual rights to the parcels. The contract I signed gave him that proof. My warehouse. My house. 40 years of my life. Repackaged as a line item on a bid sheet. I looked at the filing date. August 2nd. Danny had moved in on September 6th, which meant he created the company 5 weeks before he knocked on my door with a rented moving truck and asked if the guest room was still available. 5 weeks. He had been planning this before he set foot in my house, before he measured the walls, before Matteo drew his first picture at my kitchen table. I asked Marco, "What is the bid worth?" Marco said, "The Hayes Avenue corridor contract, if awarded, is estimated at $4.26 million in development rights over 7 years. Danny's 12% equity stake in Resnick Capital's arrangement is separate from the bid. If Danny wins the bid through Kovacs Development Group using your properties as collateral, he controls the entire corridor. Not 12%, 100%. The room went quiet. The radiator stopped clanking, as if even the building needed a moment. Sophie said, "He's not just betraying you, Dad. He's double-crossing the Resnicks, too." I thought about that. My son, the boy at the gate, the man who measured walls, had built a shell company to hijack a scheme that was already designed to rob me. He was running a con inside a con, a furnace inside a furnace. And somewhere in the layers, between the Delaware filings and the Allegheny County bids, was a man I no longer recognized. That evening, I went to the basement and I opened Irina's tin box. The box sat where it always sat, second shelf, between the toolbox and the cigar box. It was pale green, the size of a paperback novel, with a faded floral pattern on the lid. Irina had kept it on her nightstand for 38 years. After she died, I moved it to the basement, because keeping it upstairs made the bedroom feel like a room that was waiting for someone who would not return. Inside the box, 3 photographs, a pressed daisy from our wedding reception at the Polish Hill Fire Hall, a prayer card from Street Adalberts, Irina's mother's rosary, and an envelope. The envelope was sealed. On the front, in Irina's handwriting, the same handwriting that had labeled every spice jar, every Christmas card, every permission slip for 38 years, were 5 words. "Open it when you need to remember." I had seen the envelope before, many times. I had never opened it. I told myself I was saving it for when the grief became unbearable, for the worst night, the loneliest hour. But grief doesn't work like that. Grief is not a single night. It is a climate. You don't wait for the worst storm. You live inside the weather. Tonight felt like the night. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. Irina's handwriting, blue ballpoint, dated March 7, 11 months before she died. "My dear Walt, if you are reading this, I am gone and you need the truth. I should have told you when I was breathing. I was afraid. Forgive me. Danny is not yours. In the summer of 1981, before we married, I worked the register at Petrocelli's Hardware on Carson Street. A man came in every Wednesday to buy roofing nails. His name was Stefan Kroll. He worked at the mill night shift, furnace crew. We were together 3 times. Danny was born the following April. Stefan died in the Furnacicio 4 explosion in 1996. He was one of the 2 men killed. You carried his death on your body, but you never knew you carried his son in your house. Danny does not know. No one knows except me and God, and now you. I loved you every day, Walt. Every single day. That was never a lie. Irena. I read the letter 3 times. Then I folded it along the same creases and put it back in the envelope. I put the envelope in my work coat pocket, next to the paprika label and Matteo's drawing. Stefan Kroll. I remembered him. Furnace crew. Quiet man. Large hands. A scar on his left forearm from a slag splash in 1989. He died on the 14th of November, 1996. When the inspection hatch on furnace 4 blew open, and the fire took what the steel couldn't hold. I was on that shift. I was 30 feet away. I heard him scream, and he was Danny's father. I turned off the bulb. The basement went dark. The house above me breathed ductwork, floorboards, the slow expansion of old wood in cold air. 23 days. I have looked at the scar on my right wrist every morning for 29 years. I knew what it was. Burns from the inspection hatch. 3rd degree. Partial thickness. Healed over months of saline baths and pressure garments at Mercy Hospital. I knew the medical language. I knew the shape a long crescent from the base of my thumb to the first bone of my wrist, like a smile drawn by someone who had forgotten what happiness looked like. But I did not know the full story until Irena told it to me from beyond a sealed envelope. The scar was not just mine, it was Stefan Kroll's. The same explosion that marked my skin took his life. We were 30 feet apart that night, close enough that the same fire touched us both, far enough that the difference between living and dying was a single step to the left. I stepped. He didn't, and while I lay on a stretcher watching my son stand at the chain-link gate, the man whose blood actually ran through that boy was being zipped into a bag somewhere behind me on the mill floor. I sat in the basement for 2 hours after reading Irena's letter. I did not move. I did not write. The legal pad lay on the workbench, open, waiting, but my hand would not pick up the pen. There are moments when the body overrides the mind, when the circuit breaker trips and everything goes dark, not because the system has failed, but because the system knows that running at full current will burn out the motor. At midnight, I climbed the stairs, went to the bathroom, turned on the light, and looked at the scar. The same fire. The same night. Stefan's last breath and my permanent mark, separated by 30 feet of concrete floor and 29 years of a lie my wife carried to her grave. I did not cry. Steelworkers don't cry in the mill. They cry in the car, in the parking lot, with the engine running and the radio on so no one can hear. I turned on the faucet and let the water run while I stood there, both hands gripping the sink, staring at the crescent on my wrist until the mirror fogged over and I couldn't see my own face anymore. The next morning, day 33, I made a decision. I would not use Irena's letter as a weapon. Not yet. Maybe not ever. A man's parentage is not a tactical advantage. It is a truth. And truth deserves better than being deployed at a convenient moment. But I would not ignore it either. If Stefan Kroll was connected to the Resnicks beyond the mill, I needed to know. I called Sophie. I asked her to search for Stefan Kroll in every database she could access. Court records, property filings, newspaper archives. She asked why. I said, he was a man who worked at the mill. He died in the explosion. I think he may be connected to what's happening now. Sophie didn't push. She has Irena's instinct for knowing when a question should wait. That afternoon I did something I had not done in 11 years. I walked to Edna Wojcik's house. Edna lives 3 doors west on Birchfield, in a brick bungalow with a concrete Madonna in the front yard and lace curtains that haven't been changed since 1987. She is 84 years old. She was born in Polish Hill, married a boilermaker named Casimir who died in 1999, and she has lived on this street longer than anyone alive. Edna knows every family, every feud, every affair, every funeral that has passed through this neighborhood in 60 years. She is the archive. I knocked. She opened the door in a housecoat and slippers, a cup of tea in her hand, a television playing a Polish soap opera at a volume that suggested her hearing aids were in the drawer again. Walter, sit. You look terrible. I sat at her kitchen table. It was covered with a crocheted cloth, a ceramic rooster, and a stack of prayer bulletins from Street Adalberts. Edna sat across from me and stirred her tea with a small silver spoon. I asked about Stefan Kroll. Edna's spoon stopped mid-stir. She set it down carefully on the saucer, the way you set down a tool when you realize the job just changed. Why are you asking about Stefan? I said, I'm trying to understand some things about the old mill, about people who worked there. Edna studied me. Her eyes were small behind thick glasses, but they missed nothing. 84 years of watching had sharpened them into instruments, more precise than any caliper I ever used. Stefan was a good boy, she said. Came from Braddock. Worked nights at Resnick. quiet, never caused trouble. But she paused, rotating the teacup a quarter turn. He was in debt to them. To the mill, to the Resnicks, not the company. The family. Edna lowered her voice, even though we were alone. Stefan borrowed money from Victor Resnick personally, 15,000, maybe 20. This was before the banks would lend to mill workers. Victor lent money the way his father did in the old country, cash. No contract. But you owed him, until he decided you didn't. What did Stefan owe it for? Edna looked at me for a long time. Then she said, for a woman. He got a woman pregnant. Married woman. He needed money to leave town, but Victor wouldn't release him. Victor said a man in debt doesn't get to disappear. So Stefan stayed. Worked nights. Paid what he could. And then the furnace took care of the rest. I felt the kitchen tilt slightly, the way the mill floor used to shift when the overhead crane moved a full ladle, and the building absorbed the weight. A married woman. Did you know who she was, Edna? Edna picked up her spoon again. She stirred her tea. She said, I knew your wife a long time, Walter. I made her wedding cake. I held your son the day he came home from the hospital. She did not say Irina's name. She did not confirm. But the silence between her sentences was louder than any furnace I had ever stood beside. I thanked Edna. I stood. At the door, she put her hand on my arm, small, thin, strong, the way old rope is strong, and she said, whatever you're building down in that basement, Walter, build it solid. The Resnicks don't lose. Not in this neighborhood. Not ever. I walked home. The wind on Birchfield carried the smell of dead leaves and diesel from the Route 28 overpass. I counted my steps. 112. The same number as the safety report I filed after the 1996 explosion. Report 112. 2 men dead. 6 burned. 1 foreman who would carry the scar for the rest of his life and never know that the man who died beside him had fathered his son. 22 days. The scar on my wrist caught the afternoon light. I looked at it differently now. Not a reminder. Not a receipt. A bridge between a dead man's secret and a living man's fight. I opened the basement door and went down to work. Frank Petrucelli showed up at my door on day 35 with a bottle of whiskey and a face full of guilt. It was November the 18th. 6 o'clock. The sky over Birchfield Road had turned the color of mill smoke, that particular shade of gray that Pittsburgh wears from November through March, like a uniform it can't take off. Danny and Skylar were upstairs. Mateo was doing homework. I was on the porch in my mill jacket, running the act, chin down, eyes half closed. Frank came up the steps and stood in front of me. He held the whiskey like a man holding a confession tight, at arm's length, as if releasing it would release everything behind it. Walt, I need to talk to you. I opened my eyes slowly, the way a man with cognitive decline opens his eyes. Then I dropped the act. I sat up straight. I looked at Frank with everything I had 40 years of reading men's faces across furnace floors, through smoke, through half-truths, and shift-change lies. Frank, sit down. Tell me who sent you. His face cracked. Not anger, relief. The kind of relief a man feels when he no longer has to pretend. He sat in the other porch chair. He put the whiskey on the railing. He spoke. Roman Petrick had approached Frank in September. Offered him $4,000 to keep an eye on me, report on my behavior, my visitors, my mental state. Frank had been behind on property taxes. His wife had left him 2 years prior. The $4,000 covered the taxes and 3 months of heating oil. He wasn't proud of it. He said those words, "I'm not proud of it," 3 times. Each time quieter than the last. As if repetition would wear the shame down to something he could carry. Frank told me what he'd reported. That I seemed confused. That I watched television for hours. That I rarely left the house. He had given Roman exactly what the Foreman's Act was designed to produce. My performance had been so convincing that it had fooled the man who'd known me for 31 years. I asked, "What changed?" Frank stared at the street. He said, "Mateo." The boy waved at me last week from the driveway. He said, "Hi, Mr. Frank. Grandpa says you're a good neighbor, and I thought I'm spying on a man whose grandson thinks I'm a good neighbor. I'm taking money to help put a 72-year-old steelworker in a memory ward." "And for what?" "Heating oil?" He picked up the whiskey, opened it, poured 2 measures into paper cups he'd brought in his coat pocket, handed me one. "I'm done, Walt. Whatever you need. I'm done with them." I took the cup. I did not drink yet. I said, "How many others?" Frank said, "I don't know everyone. But Roman has people on 3 blocks. There's a woman who watches your house from a car on Tuesdays. There's someone at the credit union who flagged your account. And there's Hank Stanton on the corner who reports to Nadia Resnick directly. Hank Stanton, 61-8, retired electrician. Replaced my porch light in 2019 and wouldn't take payment. I had thought he was generous. Generosity, it turns out, can be purchased for the price of proximity. I drank the whiskey. It was cheap. It burned the way cheap whiskey burns fast. Artless. Honest. I said, "Frank, I need you to keep reporting. Tell Roman exactly what you've been telling him. But from now on, you report to me first. I tell you what to say." Frank nodded. "A defector is most useful when the enemy doesn't know he's defected." 2 days later, on day 37, Sophie called. She had found Stefan Kroll's records. Stefan had worked at Resnick Steel from 1983 to 1996. Night shift. Furnace crew. Badge number 4,417. He had no surviving family in Pittsburgh. His parents had returned to Poland in 1991, and a sister in Braddock had died in 2004. But Sophie found one document that stopped me at the kitchen sink with a glass of water halfway to my mouth. Stefan Kroll had filed a workers' compensation claim in 1994, 2 years before the explosion. The claim alleged unsafe furnace conditions, cracked thermocouple housings, skipped inspections, falsified temperature logs. The claim named Victor Resnick personally as the responsible party. It was denied. The denial was signed by the company's insurance adjuster, a man named Roman Petrick Sr., Roman Petrick Sr., the father of the Roman Petrick, who was currently orchestrating the theft of my house. The Resnicks had been managing people through debt and fear for 2 generations. Stefan owed Victor money. Stefan filed a safety complaint. The complaint was killed by Roman's father. 2 years later, Stefan was dead, and the only evidence of unsafe conditions was buried in a denied claim that no one had read in 29 years until a high school chemistry teacher in Lawrenceville pulled it from a digitized county archive on a Tuesday night. I told Sophie, "Bring everything to Marco. Tomorrow." That evening, Leo called. He said, "Walt, there's someone you need to meet." His name was Garrett Loomis, 53, former property manager for Resnick Capital Partners. He had worked for Victor and Nadia for 9 years managing tenant properties, overseeing renovations, processing shell company paperwork. He had left 2 years ago after what he described as a disagreement about ethics, which is a polite way of saying he refused to forge a deed and Victor fired him. Garrett was willing to talk. More than talk. He had a USB drive. We met at Gooski's, a bar on Bingham Street in Polish Hill. The kind of bar where the stools are bolted to the floor and the jukebox plays polka between innings of Pirates games. Garrett sat in the back corner, a heavy man with a shaved head and mechanic's hands. Hands that looked like they had signed too many documents they didn't believe in. He put the USB drive on the table between our beers. It was small and black, the size of a cigarette lighter. 9 years, he said. Every property transfer, every shell company filing, every email between Victor, Nadia, and Roman. It's all on there. 3 families before yours. Mr. Kovacs. Same playbook, same structure, same ending, except those families didn't have a foreman who read page 6. I picked up the USB drive. It weighed nothing. It held everything. I asked, "Why now?" Garrett looked at his beer. "Because my mother is 81. She lives in Hazelwood. And last month, Nadia Resnick's people knocked on her door and asked about her long-term care plans. The same question Frank was told to ask me. I put the USB in my coat pocket, the pocket that now contained Irena's paprika label, Mateo's folded drawing, Irena's letter, and a 2 gigabyte record of a criminal empire. My coat was becoming an evidence locker. The stitching was holding, just barely. 18 days. Marco DeLuca spread 7 documents across his desk on November the 22nd and said, "This is how we dismantle them." Day 40. 15 days remaining. The radiator in his office was running full blast, filling the room with dry heat that smelled like iron and old paint. Sophie sat on my left, Leo on my right. Garrett Loomis sat against the wall, silent, arms crossed, watching the way a man watches when he knows the blueprints are correct because he helped build the original machine. Marco had spent 4 days with the USB drive. He'd cross-referenced every file against public records, county filings, and the notes on my legal pad. What emerged was not just a case. It was a pattern 3 prior families. Same structure, same shell companies, same outcome. Elderly homeowner, family insider, predatory loan, automatic transfer, guardianship filing, residential placement, property liquidation. The Resnicks had run this operation 4 times, including mine. Each time, the target lost everything. Each time, the paper trail was buried under enough Delaware LLCs to make a forensic accountant weep. But Garrett's USB changed the math. It contained emails, internal memos, and scanned documents that connected Victor Resnick directly to every stage of the scheme. Not through intermediaries, not through shell companies, through his own inbox. His own words, his own signature. Marco explained the counter-strike. Document 1. A petition to void the collateralized guarantee I had signed on October 14th. Grounds: fraud in the inducement. The contract was presented as estate planning when it was, in fact, a predatory transfer mechanism linked to a pre-existing scheme. The UCCON filing predating my signature proved foreknowledge of intent. Document 2. A motion to cancel the UCCON financing statement on the Hayes Avenue warehouse. Grounds: the filing was made by a party Ridgeline Property Trust, acting on behalf of an undisclosed principal Resnick Capital Partners, without the property owner's knowledge or consent. Document 3. A list pendens on both properties 44, 12, Birchfield Road, and the Hayes Avenue warehouse, effectively freezing any transfer, sale, or encumbrance until the court resolved the underlying fraud claim. Document 4. A formal complaint to the Allegheny County District Attorney's Office alleging organized property fraud, elder financial exploitation, and conspiracy to file fraudulent guardianship proceedings. Marco had already spoken to an assistant DA named Torres, who had been building a separate case on Resnick Capital for 18 months, but lacked the internal documents. The USB was the missing piece. Document 5. A counterclaim against Danny Kovacs and Kovacs Development Group, LLC, for breach of fiduciary duty, constructive fraud, and unjust enrichment. This document would redirect Danny's $3,100 loan obligation back to Danny personally, stripping the collateral linked to my properties. Document 6. A motion to dismiss any future guardianship or incapacity petition filed on my behalf, supported by a cognitive evaluation I had completed 3 days earlier at UPMC Shadyside, arranged by Sophie, conducted by a board-certified neuropsychologist named Dr. Mariam Kassar. The results: no cognitive impairment, full executive function, memory, orientation, and reasoning, all within normal range for age. The Foreman's Act had fooled Danny, Skylar, Frank, Roman, and the entire Resnick network. It had not fooled a standardized neuropsychological battery. Document 7. A sealed affidavit from Garrett Loomis, detailing his 9 years inside Resnick Capital, the 3 prior victims, and the operational structure of the fraud scheme. Garrett had signed it that morning in Marco's office, hands steady, voice flat, the way a man speaks when he's made peace with the consequences. 7 documents, 7 charges in the breach. I thought of the 7 plates Irina used to set for Christmas dinner. 1 for each person at the table, each one placed with intention, each one carrying its own weight. Marco looked at me. He said, "Walt, once we file these, there is no going back. Danny will know. Skylar will know. The Resnicks will know. You will be at war in your own house." I said, "I've been at war in my own house since September." I signed all 7 documents. My hand was steady. The pen was Marco's. A heavy silver ballpoint that felt like a riveting gun in miniature. We walked out of Marco's office at noon. The November air hit like a cold water quench, the kind the mill used to cool forgings. Sudden, total, clarifying. Sophie and I stood on the sidewalk while Leo went to bring the car around. Sophie looked at me. She had something behind her eyes. Something beyond the case, beyond the documents. Something that moved in a different current. I recognized the look. Irina had worn it twice in her life. Both times in the early weeks before she told me. "Soph," she exhaled. A small cloud of breath in the cold air, the kind that disappears before you can decide if it was real. "I'm pregnant, Dad. 10 weeks. Leo and I were going to wait to tell you." But she paused, looked up at the gray Pittsburgh sky. "I don't want to wait anymore. I don't want to wait for anything anymore." I put my arms around my daughter. She was wearing Irina's wool coat, the navy one with the brass buttons that I had given her after the funeral, because Sophie was the only person in the family who fit it. I held her. She held me. The coat smelled like cedar and old lavender. The way Irina's closet had smelled for 3088. "A granddaughter," I said. I don't know why I said it. I had no way of knowing. Sophie pulled back and looked at me. "How do you know?" "I don't. But your mother always knew. She said girls arrive when the family needs rebuilding." Sophie laughed a real laugh. The kind that carries heat. Then her eyes went serious. "We're going to get your house back, Dad." I said, "I know. And then I'm going to set the table for Christmas dinner. 7 plates. The ones your mother used. The ones with the blue rim." Sophie said, "Skylar put those in the garage." I said, "I know where they are." That evening, back on Birchfield Road, I descended to the basement one more time. I updated the legal pad, page 31 now. I taped the filing receipts to the wall beside Mateo's drawings, Irina's letter, and the mill safety poster. Then I opened the tin box and placed inside it one new item. The Maple Ridge residential brochure I had found tucked inside Skylar's purse that morning, while she was in the shower and Danny was at a site in Monroeville. Room 14B was circled in red ink. My name was written in the margin in Skylar's handwriting. I closed the box. I placed it back on the shelf. 13 days until Christmas. The counter-strike was filed. The evidence was gathered. The allies were in position. All that remained was the dinner table, the 7 plates, and the moment when a son would hand his father a power of attorney and the father would say no. I turned off the bulb. 13 days. The steel was cooling. The mold was set. What came out of it would depend on who flinched first. I set the table on Christmas Eve with Irina's blue-rimmed plates. I had retrieved them from the garage at 6 in the morning, while the house slept. 7 plates. I washed each one by hand in the basement sink, dried them with a cotton towel, and carried them upstairs in a cardboard box, one at a time. The way you carry crucibles from a cooling rack, slowly, with both hands, because what's inside is more valuable than what's outside. 7 plates, 7 seats, Walt, Danny, Skylar, Mateo, Sophie, Leo, and one empty for Irina. We had always set a plate for the absent. It is a Polish custom. It is also a warning. Someone is always watching, even when the chair is empty. I cooked. Not Skylar. Me. I started at noon, and I did not stop until 5 o'clock. Pierogi Irena's recipe, from memory, the dough rolled on the Douglas fir workbench in the basement because I did not trust the kitchen counters anymore. Kielbasa from Minjowski's on Carson Street. Borscht. Real borscht. With bone broth and fresh dill. Gołąbki. With tomato sauce. Rye bread. Butter. Pickled herring. And a poppy with seed cake that took me 2 attempts because the first one cracked down the middle like a casting with an air pocket. Danny watched me cook. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed, and an expression I could not read, something between suspicion and surprise, as if a piece of decommissioned equipment had suddenly powered itself on. "You didn't have to do all this, Dad," I said. "Your mother would have wanted it." He looked at the table. He saw the blue-rimmed plates. He saw the empty 7th setting. Something moved behind his eyes fast, like a shadow crossing a furnace viewport. Then it was gone. Sophie and Leo arrived at 5:30. Sophie wore Irina's navy coat. Leo carried a bottle of wine and a bakery box, tied with red string. Sophie hugged me at the door and whispered, "Marco says the filings are in the system. Torres has the USB. It's done." I whispered back, "Not yet." We sat. 7 settings. 6 bodies. 1 ghost. The Christmas lights on the front porch blinked through the window and cast moving color across the plates: red, green, gold, red, green, gold like the indicator. Lights on a control panel, cycling through status checks. The dinner was quiet at first. Matteo ate 3 pierogi and asked for a 4th. Leo complimented the borscht. Sophie watched Danny the way a chemist watches a reaction approaching its threshold. Calm, focused, ready to step back. Danny ate slowly. Skylar ate nothing. She moved food around her plate with geometric precision, building small walls of cabbage and potato, as if fortifying a position. At 7:15, Danny pushed his plate aside. "Dad, there's one more thing I need you to look at tonight." He reached under his chair and produced a manila envelope, thinner than the first one. He slid it across the table, past the kielbasa, past the pickled herring, past Irina's empty plate. I opened it. Inside was a single document, a durable power of attorney, granting Daniel J. Kovacs full authority over the financial and medical decisions of Walter M. Kovacs. Effective immediately. Irrevocable for 24 months. I read it. Every word. I took my time. The table waited. Matteo drew a Christmas tree on a napkin with a green crayon. Leo's hand moved to Sophie's knee under the table. Skylar stopped fortifying her plate. Danny said, "It's just a precaution, Dad, in case something happens. You've been—" He paused, forgetting things. I looked up. I looked at my son. At the man who had stood at the chain-link gate in blue pajamas. At the man who had measured my walls and created a shell company and whispered into a prepaid phone that his father was slipping. At the man whose biological father had died 30 feet from me in a fire I survived and he did not. "No," I said. Danny blinked. "What?" I said, "No, Danny. I'm not signing this." The table contracted. I felt it, a physical tightening, like a bolt being torqued past its yield point. Sophie set her fork down. Leo straightened in his chair. Matteo looked up from his napkin. Skylar spoke. Her voice was quiet and sharp, a blade wrapped in silk. "Walt, Danny is trying to protect you. You've been confused. You forgot the month. You stare at the television for hours. This is responsible planning." I said, "I know what this is." The room stopped. Not silence, absence. The kind of absence that fills a mill floor in the half-second between a gauge spiking and the alarm sounding. Everyone knows something is about to happen. No one moves. I reached behind my chair. On the floor, leaning against the wall, was the old radio, a Zenith transoceanic, tube-powered, that Irina kept on the kitchen counter for 30 years. I had brought it upstairs that morning and placed it there, behind my chair, plugged into the wall outlet with an auxiliary cable running from the headphone jack to a small digital recorder I had purchased at a Radio Shack in Monroeville 3 weeks earlier. I set the radio on the table, between the pierogi and the poppy woo seed cake. I pressed play. The speaker crackled. Then a voice filled the kitchen, Nadia Resnick's voice. Recorded through the heating vent on day 30. Cleaned up by Leo, using audio software on his laptop. The warehouse alone is worth $9.50. The development group is offering $1.2 for the full parcel house, warehouse, and air rights. Danny's face went white. Danny, your share is 12%. That's $144. Skylar stood up. Her chair scraped the floor. A sound like steel. On concrete. Placement is confirmed. Room 14. B. Second floor. Memory care wing. Admission date is January 5th. I watched my son listen to his own conspiracy played back through his mother's radio, on his mother's plates, at his mother's table. We tell the court he wandered, or we tell the court he left the stove on. Either way, once he's admitted and the guardianship is filed, he doesn't come back. He doesn't come back. The recording ended. The radio hissed the soft analog hiss of a machine that has finished its work and is waiting to be told what comes next. Mateo held his green crayon frozen above the napkin. Sophie had tears on her face, but her jaw was locked. Leo's hand was on his phone, ready. I looked at Danny. I said, Room 14. B. January 5th. That was the plan. Danny opened his mouth. No sound came out. His hands lay flat on the table, on either side of Irina's empty plate, as if he were trying to hold the table together the way he had held the chain-link fence together on a night in 1996. Then Skylar moved. Skylar moved fast. She reached across the table and grabbed the radio with both hands, pulling it toward her as if silencing the machine could silence what it had said. The auxiliary cable snapped taut, caught the poppy seed cake, and sent it spinning off the table onto the floor. The cake broke into 3 pieces on the linoleum, the same crack pattern as the first attempt, the one with the air pocket. Some things are destined to break along the same lines. I held the radio. Skylar held the radio. For 2 seconds we were connected by a Zenith transoceanic, the way 2 steelworkers are connected by a beam they're both carrying. Neither can let go without the other getting hurt. She let go first. Not because she chose to, because Sophie stood up. Sophie didn't shout. She didn't need to. She placed both hands flat on the table, leaned forward, and said in a voice that could have cooled a ladle of molten iron, "Sit down." Skylar turned to her. Something rearranged itself behind Skylar's face. A recalculation. The way a control system adjusts when it encounters an input it wasn't programmed for. She had planned for a confused old man. She had not planned for his daughter. Sophie said, "The counter of filings were submitted to Allegheny County on November 22nd. The fraud complaint is with the district attorney. Every document on the USB drive is in the hands of Ada Torres. Your husband's shell company, Kovacs Development Group, is named in a list pendens that freezes both properties, and the neuropsychological evaluation." She paused and looked at Danny shows that my father has full cognitive function. He was never confused. He was watching. Danny stared at the table. His hands had not moved. They were still flat on the wood, on either side of Irina's empty plate, fingers spread, the way a man braces himself when the floor is about to give. "Dad," he said. His voice was quiet, stripped, the voice of a man hearing a structure fail from the inside, not the dramatic collapse of an explosion, but the slow, interior groan of steel bending past its limit. "You planned this," I said. "I read the contract 3 weeks before you gave it to me, Danny. I read page 6. I signed it because I thought I paused. I looked at the scar on my wrist, because I thought I owed you something. For the gate. For the fire. For every year I spent believing the explosion was my fault and your pain was my debt. Danny's jaw tightened. I said, but debt has limits. And what you did, what you and Skylar and the Resnicks built, was not a debt collection. It was a demolition. You were going to put me in a locked ward and sell everything your mother and I built for $144,000. Skylar said, this is not, I said, be quiet. I'm talking to my son. The kitchen went still. The Christmas lights blinked. Red, green, gold. The radiator ticked. Mateo sat frozen in his chair, green crayon in his hand, eyes wide, watching his grandfather and his father across a table full of food that no one would finish. Danny stood up. He stood slowly, the way a man stands when he doesn't trust his legs. His eyes were wet. His mouth was a straight line, compressed, holding back something that was either grief or rage, or the place where the two become indistinguishable. You don't understand, he said. His voice cracked on the third word. You never. I was drowning. The business was gone. The debt was Resnick, was the only one who he stopped. He pressed his fists against his temples. You were never going to lose the house. I was going to fix it. I was going to, Sophie said. Fix it? You filed a UCC lien against his property in September. You created a shell company in August. You sat in his house and measured his walls and reported to Roman Petrick that he was declining. That is not fixing anything, Danny. That is dismantling a man piece by piece. Danny turned to Sophie. And something broke. He lunged. Not at me. At Sophie. He reached for the folder she had placed on the counter, the folder containing the filings, the evidence, the counter-contracts, and when Sophie stepped between him and the counter, he pushed her. Hard, both hands against her shoulders. She stumbled backward into the refrigerator. Her head hit the handle. Leo was on his feet instantly, catching her, pulling her behind him. Sophie was pregnant. Danny did not know this. But the force of the push was the force of a man who had stopped calculating and started surviving. Mateo screamed. A single high sound, not a word. Just a frequency. The way metal screams when it shears. He dropped his crayon and covered his ears with both hands. I stood between Danny and Sophie. I am 72 years old. My right knee negotiates with gravity every morning. My scarred hand cannot fully close in cold weather. But I stood, and Danny stopped. Because a foreman in the doorway of a furnace room is a wall that even fire respects. I said, Leo, call the police. Leo already had his phone out. He dialed. I heard the tone. I heard the dispatcher's voice. Small and professional. Danny looked at me. His face was a ruin, wet, collapsed. The architecture of 43 years of pretending crumbling in real time. He said, Dad, please. I reached into my coat pocket. I took out Irena's letter. I unfolded it. I held it in front of him not to read, just to see. His mother's handwriting. Blue ballpoint. The creases worn soft from weeks in my pocket. I said, Your mother left me a letter. It contains a truth about who you are. I have carried it for 23 days. I will not use it tonight. Not in front of your son, but you will sit down, and you will wait for the police. And when this is over, when the courts are finished, and the Resnicks are finished, and the paperwork is ash, you and I will sit in the basement under the 40-watt bulb, and I will show you what she wrote. Danny sat down. He sat the way a furnace sits after shutdown, all the heat still inside. No way to release it, the metal contracting around the fire. Skylar did not sit. She backed toward the hallway. Leo blocked the front door. She stopped. Her eyes moved from face to face, calculating exit routes, calculating losses, calculating the distance between where she stood and the life she had planned. She found no opening. Blue and red lights appeared through the kitchen window. The police arrived at 7:52 p.m. 2 officers. They entered through the front door. Leo gave a statement. Sophie showed the bruise forming on the back of her head. Danny said nothing. Before they took him to the car, Danny turned to me. The officers were on either side. His wrists were behind his back. The Christmas lights reflected off the handcuffs red, green, gold, and for one moment he looked exactly like the boy at the gate. Small. Silent. Watching his father through a barrier he could not cross. He whispered 7 words. Quiet enough that only I heard them. Standing 3 feet away, in the doorway of the house he had tried to steal. I'm sorry I wasn't worth the fire. The officers led him out. The door closed. The radio sat on the table, silent. Irena's plate was untouched. The poppyweed seed cake lay in 3 pieces on the floor. I knelt and picked up Mateo's green crayon. He was under the table, curled against the leg of his chair, both hands still over his ears. I crawled under with him. I put my arm around him. He pressed his face into my chest. It's okay, buddy. Grandpa's here. He didn't speak. He just held on. The way a boy holds on when the adults above him have failed, and the only solid thing left is the man on the floor beside him. The Christmas lights blinked. The house breathed. Somewhere in the walls, the ductwork carried warm air to rooms that would never feel the same. The Resnick Empire came apart the way old structures always come apart, not in one dramatic collapse, but in a sequence of failures, each one exposing the weakness behind the next. Ada Torres filed charges on December 27th, 3 days after Christmas. Victor Resnick was indicted on 12 counts of organized property fraud, elder financial exploitation, and conspiracy to file fraudulent legal instruments. Nadia Resnick was named as co-conspirator on 8 of the 12 counts. Roman Petrick was charged separately with wire fraud, forgery, and obstruction. His father's denied workers' compensation claim from 1,994 became Exhibit 14 in the prosecution's timeline, proof that the Petrick family had been cleaning the Resnick's machinery for 2 generations. Helen Zhao surrendered her law license in January. She cooperated. Her testimony connected the UCC01 filings, the shell companies, and the Hayes Avenue rezoning scheme into a single prosecutable narrative. Marco said she cried in the deposition room. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if it matters. Garrett Loomis's USB drive became the spine of the case. 3 prior victims were identified families in Hazelwood, Homewood, and Wilkinsburg. All elderly homeowners. All targeted through family insiders. All stripped of property through the same Russian nesting doll structure. 2 of the 3 families had surviving members who joined the civil suit. The 3rd family's matriarch had died in a Maple Ridge facility 14 months after placement. Her room number was 14A, 1 door from where they planned to put me. Danny was charged with conspiracy, constructive fraud, and assault. The assault charge came from Sophie, the bruise on the back of her head. The push witnessed by Leo and Mateo, the responding officer's body camera footage that captured Sophie holding an ice pack to her skull while Christmas lights blinked behind her. Danny's bail was set at $75,000. He posted it with money I suspect came from the Resnicks, though by then the Resnicks had larger problems than my son's arraignment. In February, Marco filed the final motions. The court voided my collateralized guarantee. The UCC-1A on the Hayes Avenue warehouse was canceled. The lis pendens was lifted after the properties were confirmed free and clear in my name. Danny's $340,000 loan from Ridgeline was restructured as a personal obligation. No collateral, no automatic transfer, no connection to my house or my warehouse. Then I did something Marco said was unusual but not illegal. I bought Danny's debt. Ridgeline Property Trust was in liquidation. Its assets, mostly paper, were being sold at auction to settle the fraud judgments. Danny's loan was among them. I purchased it through Marco's office for 12 cents on the dollar. $40,800. I paid it from the proceeds of the warehouse sale. The warehouse on Hayes Avenue sold in March for $940,000, $10,000 less than Sophie's original estimate. But I was not in the business of maximizing profit. I was in the business of ending this. The buyer was a legitimate development firm from Philadelphia, with no connection to any Resnick entity. They planned to build a co-working space for tech startups. I wished them luck. That concrete floor had held heavier things than laptops. From the sale proceeds, I paid Marco's legal fees. I paid Dr. Kassar's evaluation fee. I repaid Leo for the audio equipment. I set aside a college fund for Matteo, and I set aside a second fund, smaller, quieter, for Sophie's daughter, who was due in July and who would be named Irina. The house on Birchfield Road I transferred to Sophie. A simple deed, recorded at the Allegheny County Recorder's Office by a clerk who did not know and did not need to know what that piece of paper had survived. Sophie protested. I told her, "Your mother's name was on this house for 38 years. Now yours will be." That's how it works. I stayed in the house. Sophie and Leo moved into the second floor. Matteo remained in the guest room, Danny and Skylar's room. Stripped now of the filing cabinet, the tall mirror, the magnetic spice strip. Sophie replaced nothing. She simply put Irina's spice jars back on the pine shelf I had built in 1997. The glass jars caught the morning light. Mielona paprika, back where it belonged. In April, I visited Danny. He was being held at the Allegheny County Jail on Ross Street, awaiting trial. Skylar had filed for divorce in February and moved to her parents' home in Virginia. She was cooperating with the prosecution in exchange for reduced exposure. Danny was alone. The visiting room was beige and cold, lit by fluorescent tubes that buzzed at a frequency I recognized from the mill's break room, 60 hertz, the sound of institutions. Danny sat on the other side of a scratched plexiglass partition. He was thinner. His hair was uncombed. His eyes had the flat quality of metal that has been heated and cooled too many times, no longer tempered, just brittle. I sat down. I placed my hands flat on the counter, my scarred right hand and my unmarked left, side by side, the way I used to place them on the control panel at the start of every shift. Danny looked at my hands, then at my face. I said, "I own your debt now." He blinked. $340,000. I said, "I bought it at auction. 12 cents on the dollar. You owe Ridgeline nothing. You owe me." He opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. "Why?" I said. "Because if a Resnick holds your debt, they own you. The way they owned Stefan Kroll. The way they owned Frank. The way they've owned people in this neighborhood for 40 years. I'm not going to let them own my son." Danny's chin dropped. His shoulders curved inward. He pressed his forehead against the plexiglass. And for the first time since he was 8 years old, standing at a chain-link gate in blue pajamas with a hole in the knee, my son cried. He said, "Through the partition, through the years, through everything that had been broken and could never be fully repaired. I'm not your son. You know that. You know what Mom's letter said." I looked at him. I said, "Irina's letter told me who made you. It didn't tell me who raised you. I changed your diapers at 3 a.m. I taught you to ride a bike on Birchfield Road. I sat in a burn ward for 4 weeks, and the only thing I could think about was whether you were eating breakfast. Biology is a fact, Danny. Fatherhood is a decision. And I decided 43 years ago." Danny pressed his palm against the plexiglass. I pressed mine against the other side. The glass was cold. His hand was larger than mine, now wider, younger, unburned. But through the partition, I felt what I had always felt, the weight of a boy who needed someone to hold the fence together. He whispered, "You should have let them take the house." I said, "That's not how fathers work." The fluorescent light buzzed. 60 hertz. The sound of institutions. The sound of men sitting across partitions built to keep them apart, pressing their hands together, through the only material the state allows. I left the jail at 3:15 p.m. I drove home on Route 28. The Monongahela was gray and slow below the overpass, carrying whatever the city had given it toward some place further south. I parked in the driveway. The mailbox was still crooked. I made a note to fix it. Inside, Mateo was at the kitchen table, drawing. He looked up when I came in. He held out the picture. A house. Our house. Birchfield Road. The dormer window. The front porch with two figures standing in the driveway. Both figures were smiling. Neither one was in a box. I put it on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a pierogi that Irina had bought at a church bazaar in 2006. The kitchen smelled like paprika. 1 year later, I stood on the porch of 4412 Birchfield Road and watched the first snow fall on a street that still knew my name. December the 24th. Christmas Eve. The maples were bare. The air tasted like iron and chimney smoke, Pittsburgh's winter perfume. The one the city has worn since before I was born. The crooked mailbox had been straightened. I fixed it in June, on a Sunday, with Mateo holding the level while I poured the concrete. He told me the bubble was centered. I trusted him. Children read instruments better than men. The house belonged to Sophie now. But the house did not know the difference. Houses are like steel. They don't care whose name is on the paperwork. They care about who maintains the structure. Sophie and Leo lived on the second floor. They had repainted the hallway, a pale yellow, Irina's favorite color. The color of the kitchen in the apartment on Polish Hill where Irina grew up. The color she always said made a room feel like morning even at midnight. The nursery was the old guest room, Danny and Skylar's room, and in the crib slept a 7-pound girl named Irina Rose Deluca Ukavax. She was born on July 11th at McGee Women's Hospital. At 4:17 a.m., in a room that smelled like antiseptic and Sophie's sweat. And the first breath of someone who had never known a furnace, never known a contract, never known a man named Resnick. I held her 9 minutes after she arrived. Her hand wrapped around my index finger. My scarred finger, the one the fire had marked 29 years earlier, and she gripped it with a force that no medical textbook could explain, and no steel metaphor could improve. I simply held her. That was enough. Mateo turned 9 in October. He was taller. His hair still fell into his eyes, but he had started pushing it back with his hand. A new gesture, a small declaration of visibility. He drew less often now, not because he had stopped seeing, but because he had started speaking. At school, he wrote a short essay for his English class titled, "My Grandpa's Basement." The teacher sent it home with a note. Mateo has an extraordinary ability to observe detail. Please encourage this. I taped the essay to the wall above my workbench, next to the safety poster and the faded photo of Irina at the 1989 block party. The workbench was cleaner now. The legal pad was gone. The photocopies were gone. The manila folder labeled Furnace, Maintenance, 1998 had been emptied and recycled. The evidence had served its purpose. What remained on the bench was what had always been there. A magnifying lamp, a coffee can full of nails sorted by size, and a small framed photograph of the mill furnace 4, taken in 1993, 3 years before the explosion, when the building still stood whole, and the men who worked inside it still believed that the structure would protect them. Marco DeLuca's case against the Resnicks concluded in September. Victor Resnick pleaded guilty to 7 counts and was sentenced to 11 years in federal custody. Nadia received 6 years. Roman Petrick received 4. The 3 prior victim families received restitution. Not full, not enough, but recorded. Their names were entered into the court record, the way names are entered into steel, permanently, with heat. Hank Stanton moved to Ohio. Frank Petrocelli still lived 4 doors east. He brought stuffed cabbage on Sundays and sat on the porch and said nothing useful. Which is exactly what a good neighbor does. We did not discuss the $4,000. Some debts are better left unweighed. Edna Wojcik turned 85 in August. I brought her a jar of Mielona paprika. Irina's recipe, ground by hand, labeled in blue ballpoint. Edna held the jar up to her kitchen light and said, "Your wife had the best handwriting on this street." I said, "I know." Edna put the jar on her shelf, between the ceramic rooster and the prayer bulletins, and she poured me a cup of tea without asking if I wanted one. That is how Polish women say "I love you," not with words, but with tea they were already making. Danny's trial ended in November. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy and constructive fraud. The assault charge was reduced to a misdemeanor. Sophie requested the reduction. I did not ask her why. Daughters carry their own scales. He was sentenced to 22 months. He is serving them at a minimum security facility in Morgantown, West Virginia. I have visited 3 times. Each visit is the same. Plexiglass, fluorescent light, 60 hertz. We talk about Mateo. We talk about the weather. We do not talk about the contract, the resniks, or the 7 words he whispered on Christmas Eve. Those words are in the walls now. They travel through the ductwork. They do not need repeating. On the morning of my last visit 3 weeks ago, Danny handed me something through the exchange slot. A card. Handmade. Construction paper, folded unevenly, with a drawing on the front. A house. Our house. Birchfield Road. The dormer window. The porch. The mailbox straight now. No black sedan. No box around the figures. Inside, in Danny's handwriting, not a child's handwriting anymore, but a man's. Small and careful. The letters pressed hard into the paper, the way you press a stamp into hot metal. "Thank you for choosing me." I put the card in Irina's tin box. It sits there now, on the second shelf, between the toolbox and the cigar box full of furnace inspection tags. The box contains 3 photographs, a pressed daisy, a prayer card, a rosary, a letter from a woman who loved me every day, and a card from a son who is learning what that means. On Christmas Eve, I built a fire in the fireplace for the first time in 4 years. Sophie and Leo sat on the couch. Baby Irina slept in a bassinet by the window. Mateo lay on the floor with a new box of crayons, drawing something I couldn't see. Frank sat in the recliner, eating a pierogi with his hands. Edna had sent a plate of cookies shaped like stars, with a note that read, "Don't burn these." I took the last document from my coat pocket. The original contract. 14 pages. Legal paper. The font tight, the language tighter. Page 6. The clause. The 60 days. The name I had never heard, and the dollar amount with 6 figures. I held it over the fire. The paper caught, slowly curling at the edges first, then flowering inward, the flames turning the words into heat, and the heat into nothing. 14 pages. 30 seconds. The contract that was supposed to take everything I had built became ash, and the ash rose into the chimney and out into the Pittsburgh night, where it joined the iron and the chimney smoke and the snow. Mateo looked up from his drawing. He said, "What was that, Grandpa?" I said, "Just old paperwork, buddy. It doesn't matter anymore." He nodded. He went back to drawing. I sat in my chair, not the recliner, but the wooden kitchen chair I had carried to the living room, the one Irina used to sit in when she watched me cook. The fire crackled. The Christmas lights blinked. Red, green, gold. The house was warm. Steel remembers every fire it survives. It warps. It discolors. It carries the mark long after the heat is gone. But it does not break. That is the one thing they never understood. The Resnicks, the Petricks, the lawyers, the shell companies, the men in black sedans. They built their scheme on the assumption that old steel is weak steel. They were wrong. Old steel is steel that has already survived the furnace. It knows the temperature. It knows the duration. And it knows better than any blueprint, any contract, any clause on any page, exactly how much fire it can hold before it bends. I held the fire. I did not bend. The snow fell on Birchfield Road. The house breathed. And somewhere in the basement, under a 40-watt bulb that still hadn't burned out, the workbench waited clean, patient, ready in case the foreman ever needed it again.